when you think about addiction, it's isolated connection with a substance or something. Instead of living in that secrecy around something that you're doing, open up, talk to someone about it, let it out. The antidote to addiction is human connection.
Yeah, there's no stress for Jason. This guy, I mean, anyone who's watching on camera, look at this guy. He looked like he's just got done with the modeling shoot.
Yeah, I just got done speaking. I was actually speaking to about 100 18 to 25-year-olds. So yeah, it was at church.
I guess I should ask you the topic, but I better give you a proper intro. We have Jashin Howell on today, and we'll kind of go through our relationship. We've known each other for 20 years now, which is pretty wild. And you're doing business development, as strategic relations for the FAM project. But what were you speaking about today?
Today I was sharing it was a devotional. So I wasn't always a Christian. I fell into addiction at an early age. And so I was just sharing how I found Jesus Christ and how I turned my life over to him and how it changed everything. Just crazy when you look back and you kind of dig back into old cobwebs of your past, and find those moments and these key things that actually happened at those pivotal times that let you know that, God and Jesus are always there, and aware of us. And so, I know that this podcast isn't necessarily all about the spiritual side of things, but at the end of the day, it's what changed my life. And not saying that you don't talk about that, but, I know it's for entrepreneurs. It's for those people that have had different experiences in business, and my journey actually from that was kind of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing today. Because I see in business right now how many of us struggle with making family a priority, and really losing ourselves to our business. Like that becomes our addiction in essence, And so coming from an addiction background, I can see these patterns show up in my own life and in the lives of other people. And, a lot of people always talk to me about, things that are happening with them and asking for help on how I overcame certain things. Kind of like what happened to me today, just a lot of the younger guys came over and said, hey, look, I'm dealing with this or I'm dealing with that. And they don't know who to talk to sometimes, So I think as an entrepreneur, we're just going solo and, but there's not a real place for vulnerability or authenticity because we have to feel like we're perfect, sometimes when we're leading the charge. And it's like, who does the leader talk to when they need someone to talk to?
Yeah, it's lonely, man.
Yeah, totally.
How difficult is that for you to be vulnerable, to think about, you mentioned, getting those cobwebs, looking at those past experiences, does that wear on you? Is it tough to kind of open up those old wounds?
No, I like it. It allows me to just be grateful for the experience. And I know that just from experience and sharing it often, because I'm extremely vulnerable and authentic. I don't hide any of this stuff from anybody. And I feel like when I open up with a lot of these conversations, it just allows me to have a deeper relationship with people, and our conversations become more intentional and purposeful. And it's not just fluff things. I actually can dive deep with people really quickly just because of my willingness to be vulnerable and authentic. So I actually lean more towards it than shying away from it. I try to find opportunities to actually create more relationships around that.
When, as you're speaking to, younger generation, 18 to 25 right now, you and I are a little bit past that. What are some of the things that they're, a lot past that. What were some of the concerns? What are you seeing their concerns to be right now, in this generation with, technology, business, college debt? Like there's a lot of things that they're, trying to consider for their life. Like, what do you feel is pulling at them?
Distraction, and that was me. Like in 2018, I had just, so when my wife and I got married in 2002, I had already had a child, and she wasn't a part of my life when I was struggling with my addiction. And then I found Jesus Christ around age 25. It took me about 3 years to really learn how to live differently, because there's a lot of shame associated with, that type of lifestyle, and everything was in secrecy. So what I find is that, when there's secrecy, it sabotages your success. And I think a lot of men and people today are struggling with digital addictions and distractions. A lot of times that shows up in the way of pornography, and that's probably one of the most harmful and easily accessible addictions that are out there today that are affecting a lot of men and even women too. I'm actually on the advisory committee for an addiction recovery studio location. It's a 2-year program called the Vulcan Academy, and it's at the end of Val Vista and Hunt Highway. So right there, they have a huge ranch, and men and women are there for 2 years. They commit to their lives, and a lot of them are there only for pornography addiction, not for substance abuse. Which I find fascinating because it's just as addictive and controlling as any other substances that are out there. And so when you ask, what do I see happening today? Well, we're introducing technology to kids age 2 to 8. We hand some kind of a screen to them. It's highly addictive, creates dopamine in the brain, does the exact same thing that drugs and alcohol do. Between ages 8 and 11, they're introduced to pornography through the same tool that most of us parents use as a nanny tool. Right. And so it's not that we're bad. We just don't know how to parent around technology today, And so being mindful of when we give kids phones is something that we need to pay more attention to. Because what happens after consuming pornography is that there's a level of shame, like we talked about, that's associated with consuming that kind of content because we know it's wrong. It's just something about it just doesn't feel right. And then we start, lust becomes this new kind of way of living, and we objection, like our wives and stuff like that, if we're married, or women in general, they're objects, and they're not, you're not seeking real connection in relationships. And as I started investigating my own life in 2018, I realized that phones was really destroying my family. I almost got a divorce. My wife and I were extremely challenged in our marriage. Since I had that time in my life in my 20s where I had to play catch up because everybody was full swing in their career right when I was turning 30 and getting married, and at that time, I had to provide for a new wife. I had an 8-year-old daughter at the time. We were about to have a family and started having kids. So, I felt like I had to play catch up, and so work became my new addiction. And, technology and my phone is how I did a lot of my work, constantly on the phones because I'm a connector. I'm the relationship builder. Mm-hmm. And I traveled all the time. So I was away from home all the time. And so when my wife and I hit that 2018 timeframe, she actually was reading in her journal about something that happened to her as a child that she totally blocked out. And so even though it wasn't fully just me and her, there was some other things, we both realized we had some work to do on ourselves, to actually help us become better in our relationship, and when I look at parenting, we were kind of passively parenting, we were giving kids screens, not knowing that of the damage at the time that, and the effects of it, and starting to realize that we need to be more intentional in our relationship and with how we raised our kids. And so we've been able to go through a lot of healing, and uncovering some of those old childhood wounds that we never really fixed, those traumas that everyone's got something, that story that we tell ourselves. And so as we went through that, we've got a beautiful relationship now, and that's what birthed the FAM project, Family Awareness Movement. How do we help families find that lost art of human connection? Because when you look at it, the antidote to addiction is human connection. It really is, and when you think about addiction, it's isolated connection with a substance or something, right? Where you're doing it all by yourself. And so if you recognize there's things in your life that you're doing on your own and away from other people and in isolation, that's when you should start, warning signs should come up. Hey, maybe I need to do something different. And then instead of living in that secrecy around something that you're doing, open up, talk to someone about it, let it out. Anyway, so I was a part of a 600 men group And this 600 men, they all put us into these small little 30 men pods, if you will. And we all shared some of the most, something that we've never shared with anybody else. Like everybody went around the room and just was real vulnerable on things that never shared with anybody. And the common theme amongst all of those men was pornography and lust was a part of, some of the things that they struggled with. And we found that common in all of the other groups and teams that were there. And so that's, we're really passionate about this work on how we can actually help families and start with the men in the homes, because I didn't have a dad growing up, right? And so when you look at the fatherless kids, those kids that were latchkey kids that didn't have a dad, you can see a huge difference between those that grew up with a father and those that didn't. And so that we want to help raise up the awareness for men. We got a project called the Abundant Man Project that we're doing right now to get men to show up more as a dad and a husband, and be connected to God and feel the love of God, So those are the things that I'm passionate about. I know I said a lot in a little, you probably didn't ask to be unloaded on all that, but I think that our self-worth is really where a lot of these youth and these young men and young women are struggling right now. It's like recognizing that there's more to life than a screen, technology, which is where a lot of us get distracted. And I include myself in it, so.
It's tough. I mean, and I want to come back to that. I think you made a comment earlier. You were saying, there's this point that you get married at 30 and you felt like you're playing catch up. Was this society pressure? Was it pressure on yourself? What was it that made you feel like, hey, I have to be traveling all the time. I have to be working all the time. I think one thing that's tough about being a business owner, an entrepreneur, you mentioned it's lonely, right? There's a lot of times you don't have people to talk to. You're kind of shielding everything yourself. You're dealing with a lot of problems. You don't have really, a lot of people to talk to that would understand. You try not to bring it home. At the same time, all of us have been there where you get an email or a text that kind of throws your mood. Your kid's there and your kids are fighting, and then you lose your temper with them. I mean, there's all these little elements to it that, we're trying to balance this pressure. And, it's not like inflation's help, cost of living, there's a lot of things we're trying to balance. And, what have you seen just from your personal experience and, through these programs with others, that you start to see where this secrecy, how it's starting to sabotage their success?
Well, I just going back to the business owner that doesn't know how to be vulnerable, especially if they're leading, because what it can do is create concern and uncertainty. And, it's like people are looking, especially in a job setting, it's like, who do you talk to? Like, it's hard to confide in those that are working for you, right? So I think mentorship is probably one of the most important things that a lot of business owners don't necessarily do or don't spend the time to do. It's just working on themselves. Mm-hmm. I see that that's probably one of the biggest things is working on you, and as I started to build out the FAM project ecosystem and what we wanted to do, we want to help parents become more proactive. But in order to have a proactive parent, you have to have a proactive partnership, even if they're still not with the mom or dad, right? You need to proactively still raise those kids, even if you're a blended family, right? And then even before that, you have to do your own personal growth work, like what Tanya and I had to go through, my wife, is really working on yourself and being proactive. And if you look at it, like Tony Robbins talks about the 2 spiritual needs that we have to have met. There's 6 total needs: the need for certainty, the need for variety, the need for significance. And then those are your primal needs. And then the need for love, is the bridge to the spiritual needs, the need for our own personal growth and the need for contribution. How do we serve the world? Right. And so in 2018, here I am, recognizing that I had a lot of secrets, at the time. It's like constantly working, and I almost flirted with, a relationship with someone else because I didn't have my needs met with emotionally, with my wife. And so I didn't do anything, but, I had an emotional connection with a woman. And so that it's just made me start realizing this, like, wait a second, this is getting into territories that it could go the wrong way, and I could affect my marriage. And so, and same thing with my wife, because we were separated there for a while. So those were some of the hard things that we had to go through. And we needed other people to talk through this with, and fortunately we had an ecclesiastical leader that, was mindful of our situation, that helped us through some hard things. I had a really good friend that, had been through some similar things. And so for me personally, I was willing to reach out to other people that I knew were struggling with some similar things, or at least gone through it. And I really feel like the mess in our life is meant to be a message for other people. Like, how do we take our experiences in life and let that, serve other people? And that's where the whole purpose thing comes into fruition for me, and the Fan Project really is about, how do we as men, women, and people, how do we share our experiences with other people? How do we reach back and help someone go through what we just came through? I actually have a framework called failures, and failures is an acronym for, in order to go, when you go through a failure or something goes wrong, the F is forgiveness. Have to have forgiveness of self, which is the last one. You usually forgive others, and then God. Sometimes, if something happens to us, we're blaming everybody else, and so forgiveness has to be one of those things that we let go of. And then acceptance. We have to accept that those things happen. There's nothing you can do to change anything in your past. All you got to do is move forward. And then the I is for inclusion. Include other people in your healing journey, because doing it alone doesn't work. Again, that secrecy, it keeps that shame locked in, and you're surrounded by it. And then that leads to this love, love of self, love for others, love for God. And then, which moves us through understanding, reflective times, and then empathy, so that we can now serve others through what we just came through, failures. Right. So I feel like if we can take these moments in our lives and we can find the reason for them and the purpose for them, a lot of times it's just, how do I serve others that went through that painful experience? And I know you had a couple of painful experiences too, on a health scare, and I know you had some other things that you've gone through as well, in your personal relationships. Right. And so those things are hard, but there's a lot of men that have gone through it as well. And I feel like, and I think probably why you're doing this podcast, so you can give back. It's like, how can I pull out, some of these jewels to help other people? And, we're on 340 podcasts with you, and it's amazing, and I listened to the podcast just before the one that you just put out right now. And when you were doing this work with another contractor in another location, and you talked about I think it was Builder 20 or something you called it, but
Yeah.
actually do this work with other builders, and you guys all share financial information, and it's like this mastermind that helps you kind of grow. And you can talk to now people, you have this peer group, and so you talk about, like, what's the solution? Like, right there, what you just did, you demonstrated exactly how that can be done with people that love you, they care about you, and they're willing to do whatever they can to help support you.
I love that you said that, Jason, because there is value to vulnerability and connection and human connection. Because, I think, I've seen a lot of people, especially in construction, our industry is one of the number one industries where people struggle with mental health, with suicide. It's like a very, it's tough. I think in general, there's a lot of societal pressure, right, that all of us deal with. You mentioned how that goes into being a business owner, and you're trying to balance family and, addictions and other things, maybe in silence. But, at the core, whether it's health related, whether it's personal life, there's something about sharing that is bonding. You mentioned the Builder 20. What I do appreciate that is, yes, we do have the financial aspect, but I think you could pick up on, at least it seems you did, Scott and I, who was on the episode, there's a friendship and bond there that's much deeper, right? We share our trials, we share our tribulation, we share, these sad moments. We had a meeting in Kansas City. This is 2 years ago. and you kind of sit in this round table giving your like company updates, and I think like four of us were sharing updates and like crying emotionally just with being overwhelmed with certain, phases of life. And for some, it could have been personal, marriage stuff. For some, it could have been like bankruptcy things they're looking at, or like, struggles financially. But, there's something to be said about, that is part of the reason, what the podcast is, you're always seeking to share personal experiences and bring value to the listener. And, this episode's much different than some I've had, and this is one I really look forward to because, Jason, to give you some credit, I mean, I was telling someone today, they asked me this morning, they said, who do you have on the podcast today? And I said, I have Jason. They're like, well, who's Jason? I said, what's funny is Jason I met 20 years ago, and I only lived next to him for probably 10 months. And he had a huge impact on me in 10 months. And this is 20 years ago. And we've ran into each other and, different events and, similar networks and, at Lifetime Gym. I mean, sit in the sauna. But I said, the funny thing is like, Jason, even from day one, like this is someone that gets it. I mean, you were open about your addiction to me back in 2006 and, things you went through. And so why I went through trials later, it's things like that, I could look at and say, hey, well, Jason did it. Someone else did it. Like, and I think a lot of times we just feel alone. Like, a lot of people that have experienced a lot of failure, one thing they always say, it's really never as bad as you think. When you look back 5 years later and you look back 10 years later, you're like, man, I was so stressed about, this issue in my life. Maybe it was with my kids. Maybe it was with a payment a client owed me, whatever. But, these things do come to pass at some point. And, sometimes we just lose our grasp on reality because, we feel like our world's crashing on us at the current moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes we're so in it that we do need to lean on someone else to help see things from a different perspective, and that's why we're creating this kind of movement around, families just being there for each other, and because here's the thing, what I find is that a lot of times you fall down for whatever reason. There's some people that feel like, they get happiness or enjoyment out of seeing us fail for whatever reason, and I'm not saying that all people are like that, but how do we become a light for other people? How do we uplift each other, and really get to know like, hey, what's going on? And there's ways to recognize when something's going on with someone, right? You can just feel an energy about it. So the more in tune that we can get and the more connected we can have, not just on a superficial level, but like really deep connection, then you can feel these things and you can sense these things and you can ask questions where someone will open up around what's going on. And just that opening right there is, opening up the healing process, and sometimes someone just needs to talk to someone else about it. I do want to ask you a question because I know, and I don't know, if you're okay with talking about it, but I know
Please.
like right after we were together, in Met, rather not together, but right after we met, and you went through a challenge, in your relationship, and you got a divorce, right? So I don't know if you've talked about much of that, and and what that was like for you. What did you have to go through? How did you have to change in order to be the person to have the relationship and the wife that you have now? How did you maintain a co-parenting relationship with, your ex and what were some of the things that you had to do? And I'm sure there was a lot of personal growth work that you had to do. And there's challenges in that. Like I know what it's like to have a daughter that's being raised by, her mom and a stepdad, so it's not easy, but I always tried to make it so that it wasn't about, I didn't want to use my daughter as, a tool, to get back at anybody. And you see that happen a lot of times in relationships, so if anybody's listening, it's like, don't do that. Like the kids are the ones that they don't need to be used for getting back at anybody, right? And when there's separation in the relationships. And I just see that happen all too often. And it just pains me because the kids are taking the brunt. And anyway, so what was that like for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, Jason. I think, maybe I'll come back to my personal side here in a second, but I think what you learn through these experiences, I in a lot of ways I didn't have the tools necessary when I was going through that, right? And I think that's what's tough about life is you really only have, your life experience to that point. And I feel like, now 20 years ago, I think I could have handled things a little bit different and for a lot of reasons, through that. But the nice thing is that when I was going through that, divorce, I think there's this innate natural part of like that human element where, you're upset, you're frustrated, you're angry. And I had I'm the oldest of six kids and I had four siblings. I have four siblings whose spouses, my in-laws, brother and sister-in-laws, who all came from divorced families. And their counsel always was like, Brad, because you're dealing with this like frustration at the time. And you see your kids being maybe persuaded by your ex-partner. And you kind of allude to this and you kind of can see how kids can be pawns in this thing. And they would say, Brad, no matter what, like never, ever speak ill of, their mom. Don't speak ill, especially to the kids. Like always like live the best you can to be an example to them. Because the thing is like, they may hear things and things may happen that may influence them, but kids are intuitive. They're smart, at the end of the day, 10, 15, 20 years from now, they'll have a different perspective if you're steady and consistent and you show up and you're there. And the reality, their self-esteem could be affected by decisions you make and things you say. And you realize that when you think about co-parenting, I have a much different, having lived through co-parenting and, blended families, my perspective definitely is much different now about how even more important it is to show up between mom and dad. And as mom and dad get remarried or are with different, partners, how important it is that for the kids that you can still be bonded and unified and eliminate tension. But I just think in general, it's, you become a lot more mature to realize the value of what kids are seeing and feeling. And I think there's a lot of application there. I mentioned, you kind of allude to this. I had a stroke a few years ago. I've said that, on the podcast, I've said that on my documentary. And I think that, these things happen in life where it just kind of changes how you view decisions you're making and conversations you're having. And, the company I want to lead, the people I want to be with, the clients I want to work with. And you try to structure so many things to like have an environment where I can show up, I can perform, I can, to your point, there's definitely been times in my life where I'm pursuing my career and I'm working too many hours, and you kind of have these things get set back in their proper balance, when you go through these hardships.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, like on not speaking ill of, the other party, husband or wife, or, whoever's listening, that is the mother or father of your child. And because at the end of the day, they're half, both of you guys. Right. Mm-hmm. And so if we're speaking ill of them, then what does that say about your kids? You know what I mean? And so now they take it internally and they almost in a weird way, make it about them. Right. And so I love that you say that because I see that that's probably the biggest thing to avoid when in a situation like that. So I commend you for, everything that you did on that side, because that's vital.
For you, Jason, as you look back to 2018, things can get rocky in any relationship and your business. And again, you have a lot of businesses and a lot of pursuits. Where does that maturity, where does that self-reflection come where you're able to like pivot and make a change to now you're in a great place? It's easy to say that, but at the time, there's a lot of work. I would imagine mentally, emotionally, physically, part of it's probably a little bit of pride, of, we're trying to get it right, not be right. And, that it's easy to say that, but when you're living through that and you're frustrated by somebody or by yourself or by others, it's really hard to, to really be in the right state of mind to make like real change.
Well, for me, I know that everything happens for our betterment, and there's a reason behind all of it. There's a lesson to be learned, right? And so I think that if we keep learning the same lesson over and over and over again, we haven't actually learned the lesson, right? If the same thing keeps happening over and over and over again. So what do we have to do differently, right? And I think also, just going back to a spiritual, connectedness, I think God has a path for us, and it's like there is a work that I feel like we're all called to do in a sense, right? And like this work with the FAM project is something I've felt called to do. And I know you're probably familiar with Dan Martell, but I heard him on a podcast one time, and he talked about your calling, right, or a calling, and he's like, "What's in between the C and the G in calling?" And I had never heard this before. What is it?
Yeah, all in.
Yeah, all in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, that's so crazy because I feel like I'm all in on this. And, I think that when we find our true purpose for why we're here, which is not our work, it includes family, it includes how we serve other people. Those are the things that really matter most. And finding that balance is what, you're kind of alluding to. It's like when you're out of balance is when you start seeing things kind of blow up, and the wheels fall off. Right. And that's when, it's like, hey, you need to reposition, and, sometimes it's financial. Right. And so, hey, maybe there's something financially that you have to learn. Maybe, there's certain principles around everything. There's like laws that govern the universe or the world. You know what I mean? And if we're out of balance in any one thing, then we're going to see the ramification from it. So for me, because I've gone through so much change, I know there's more. Like I still have stuff that I know I'm going to be working through. And I don't think I'll ever stop growing or developing until I'm on the other side, and embracing my Heavenly Father. And I think what's interesting that you talked about on the stroke side of things, because I've been watching a lot of near-death experience videos recently. And one of the things that is common for almost all that I've seen is that when they go on the other side and they go through that experience, they come back with such an appreciation for life, and they're totally different and changed. And I think you probably had that same experience, and me in 2020, I found out that I had prostate cancer, and so I think when you have like these certain scares around, like that's the F, we're all about helping people find balance in the 7 F's: faith, family, fitness, finance, freedom, fulfillment, and fun. Right. And so the fitness side of things, your health side of things is one of those things that, man, I got to be more diligent in how I'm taking care of myself, and unfortunately for you, I mean, you were like doing all the right things. It was just something that, that you couldn't control. Right. And so, for me, I could control everything, and I'm still mistreating myself sometimes because even though I got rid of some of my substance abuse addiction, it showed up in sugar, and numbing out to, overeating and just different things like that. It's like we have our ways of dealing or not dealing with our emotions, right? And I think that when I started working through that and not just avoiding hard conversations, especially with my wife, and understanding that, lust was a part of some of the issues that I had. Pornography wasn't really huge for me, but, I've struggled with that, and found myself, but it wasn't really something that like substance abuse. But I noticed that, kind of that whole lustful thing was where you're not really emotionally connecting with your wife. Right. And that's what they want more than anything. Right. It's not about the physical action of intimacy. It's about the emotional intimacy is what they're out for. And so anyway, I know it's a different topic, but, I'm just trying to help like any of those men out there, you want to make some shifts in your life. These are some of the areas that, that your wives would appreciate, is becoming more in tune with them and really truly just being with them and not with an agenda. And that's what really helped and has been helping my marriage.
What's brought you to this point, Jason? I think, what's interesting is, and again, not that there's anything wrong with either direction, but I think in life, things that are tangible. And what I mean by that, it's easy to pursue a business where maybe you can find a lot of financial success. Maybe you have a lot of accolades. Fortunately for me, I have great clients. They've been very successful. They built great homes. Well, when I have someone online, which I don't get a ton of, but a troll, like kind of eat the rich kind of mentality. They make these comments, well, they're building this, this is overkill. And, what's tough is a lot of people that have been successful, they can hide their money, they can put it wherever, but they're choosing to invest in something that, thousands of people work on. They make a living. I make a living, my employees, trades, a lot of people, blue collar, they're doing well. But the direction I'm going is there's a lot of people that can find different avenues of success that fulfill them, right? And typically when you do a venture like the FAM project, you're not doing this for a huge lucrative, like in most cases, when you're doing something like this, it's impactful. It's not going to be the same as creating a widget and putting that on repeat, and selling that around the world. You know what I mean? And so it takes a lot of commitment. It takes sacrifice from you yes, you may feel like you're life in balance, but there's a significant investment in doing things like this and these projects that have huge impact, that have much more of an impact emotionally and physically and spiritually, as you mentioned, than they do financially. How hard was it for you to realize that at this point in your life, this is the direction you want to go? Because you're young, you're not old.
I'm 53. I'm old.
Well, you look like you're 45. So,
well, actually, to be honest with you, because of my experience and what I've done for a living, which has been mostly on the marketing side of things and selling consumer goods to families, there is a lot of income in what we're actually launching. We just happened to launch during COVID. So it was really challenging because ours was all about get out of the house, spend more quality time together,
yeah,
right? And so
right.
Unfortunately, it was poor timing,
Yeah.
And so that was challenging because I know that, God wrote this on my heart to do this work. And we do have a financial mechanism that is extremely lucrative. Because ultimately at the end of the day, we're creating an app called Fam Central. It'll be launching, at the same time that we're doing the Abundant Life Live event. And it's really a marketplace for families to find all the resources that they're looking for, expert thought leaders around marriage, couples relationships, how to manage screens in the home, all the people that are already teaching that stuff. We don't want to create all of that stuff. We want to expose families to the stuff that works and has worked and just be the one that vets it out. And then small business owners, we're all about helping small business owners find their people, right? And so we want people to be what we call liberty spenders, where you're spending money with businesses that share in the same values that you do. There's a real good friend of ours named Kurt Lutert, and him and his wife, Kristen, actually wrote the book, Liberty Spenders. And so they actually they raised about $600 million from these conservative Christians, 90 million of them, that spend and vote with their dollars, right? So that's kind of what we're doing, is curating that environment. And, I call it feel. So families is our number one priority. How do we help families? And then entrepreneurs, how do we help small businesses find those families? And then how do we help expert thought leaders find those families? And then how do we help charities? The L, so feel, families, entrepreneurs, experts, and love, which is charities. How do we help them find their volunteers or people that want to support their cause? And, so it's all about awareness and thinking from a marketing brain. It's like, okay, well, all I got to do is build one thing, Fam Central. And then now I can bring all the businesses inside the platform. I can bring all the expert thought leaders inside the platform and create a referral marketing system around it, which is my background as well as I've worked a lot of consumer products, mostly in the health space is what I started off in, personal growth and then skill set development. I've been on the lead gen side. And so how do we scale lead gen? Well, you work with publishers that already have your audience or lists, and then you create an offer and put it in front of them. And so that is what I'm expert in, and creating connections and bringing all the right people together. So for me, it was like everything that I've been doing in my life has led up to this. I think what's different about this is it's more intentional, is that we want to do it around families. We want to make that our differentiator that, hey, look, if you're going to do business, do it the right way. Have balance in your life. Make sure that you and your wife are the most important piece, because you're the example to set for those kids that you're raising to learn how to be, good people in the world, and how to go out there and make a difference in the world. I call it get mad, make a dollar to make a difference. So even though it feels like a nonprofit sometimes, or did, now we're starting to get into income production, because we just acquired a couple of companies. And so lots of real cool momentum is happening right now, and cash flows are just about to, happen very quickly. So,
which is
it's not
amazing.
so nonprofit-y.
Yeah. So yeah, and again, it takes time, right? These things, like any business, it takes time. It's not, no one's an overnight success, 20 years in the making. When people are interested in the fan project principles, right? As you're bringing people in and building this community, what are you hoping to change?
Family culture. Hoping to help the youth of today know where their value is. We're creating and starting this this Abundant Man project, where we're focusing on men first, because we see that that's the biggest area of momentum that we can have as with these men. And one of the guys in the group said, if we can help people feel the love of God, I think that we've done our job. So as long as we allow people to know that they do have a father that loves them, it's not an earthly father, it's a heavenly father that cares deeply for them, and that they can find value in knowing that they are a child and son or daughter of God. I think that's the biggest thing. It's like, that's the foundational piece, and then how do you do life with tools? How do you do life with, because it's one thing to, have God in your life, but I had to learn how to work on my mindset, because as a business owner, you have to start thinking differently, have to start paying attention to your language. You have to start working out, because Tony Robbins talks about, NLP, neuro linguistic programming. He calls it NAC, right? But it's he just teaches the three things. They call it the triad, So it's your physiology. What are you doing physically? How are you showing up physically? It's your language. What are you telling yourself? And then your focus. What are you focused on? And if you can just modify those three things and actually focus on what you want, and actually speak things into existence instead of speaking negatively about yourself, because we beat ourselves up a lot of times, and if we be more conscious of that, and then working out, taking care of our bodies, those types of things can move the needle on how we show up in the world. And so that's what we want, is to just give that foundational framework and a brotherhood, a sisterhood, and a familyhood, if you will, of other people that are on the same journey, that have the same intentionality of wanting to be there for the next generation, and do it through example and demonstration, and not just what I say, but what I do.
Well, based on what you do and what you have done, Jason, I mean, as you look back to maybe these pivot points, right? You mentioned, addiction early on, and how that led to, losing your daughter for a while, and then getting, everything put back together through that addiction. And then, this pivot you made back in 2018. You talked about that there were 6 things, right? You had, I think, certainty, variety, significance, love, personal growth, and contribution. Someone who's struggling with addiction, someone who's struggling mentally, maybe they're in a rut, maybe they're struggling with family things, where should they focus? If you look at those 6, what would make the biggest impact for them, to start somewhere?
Serve someone else. Like, when you stop worrying about yourself and thinking about yourself and isolating yourself, because that's what happens. You're just so concerned and wrapped up in you that you forget other people. And so when you start to take off that frame of, you're the most important thing in the world, to now make someone else, not to where you sacrifice yourself, but to where it's, you're deliberately serving in a way and giving back in a way. And I think that's one thing that can take you away from it. I'm going to share a really quick story. We were knocking on doors in our neighborhood with those people that were on our congregation list. And so knocked on a door, and one of the guys came to the door, and he, I asked if the Tates were there, and he's like, no, I'm sorry, the Tates don't live here. And we told him that we were inviting some of the families out to our Christmas Sunday, service. And so he immediately came out the door, and he's like, I've been struggling with God. And he started to tell me that his son committed suicide a month prior. And he's been struggling so hard over the last couple of months that I've been communicating with him and trying to help him get out of this rut that he's in. And forgiveness is one of those things. I think forgiveness of self is the thing that most of us have the hardest time doing. Like when I was going through my addiction, I knew that God forgave me or could forgive me, and I was willing to forgive other people. But for whatever reason, I could not forgive myself for not being there for my daughter. And so that focus was something that was really, really tough. And so it really comes down to love and serving other people and personal growth. So those three at the top are the three areas that it's not just one thing, it's kind of like more a blend of those things. And if you look at the two great commandments, it's to love God and to love others as you love yourself, right? And so there's that third one in there that most people don't even realize is there. So how do we love ourselves? Well, let's forgive ourselves. Let's have a little bit more grace, because I think we're our own worst critics at times. And so when we can let go of those things and then just forget about ourselves and serve other people in some capacity or way, and maybe it's helping someone that's two steps behind you, and that's what I love about AA programs, and is because that some of those last steps are all about serving and giving back to other people, right? And actually doing this work to make it be more intentional and how you can have an effect on another person. So that's what I would say.
It's funny because I think we share the same philosophy there. I think in times that you're most depressed or down, service makes a big change. Even in small things, you think about, for my kids, and this is really any part of a relationship. If you're struggling with maybe someone at work, who you work with, or, someone in your life, maybe it's a spouse, whoever, like, the service really humbles you in a lot of ways. Like I tell my kids, two of my kids were having a hard time getting along. And I told one of them, I said, well, why don't you go put away your siblings' clothes for them? Go make their bed for them. And it's like, that's the last thing you want to do. Right. And you think about doing these kindness, but what it is, there's this humbleness about it, this sacrifice. And really, it just changes maybe that human nature a little bit. And, a lot of times we fall into these ruts, and I love that you brought up that a lot of times we have trouble forgiving ourselves. I think as a business owner, specifically with business, there's things I've struggled with where I made a mistake. I could have handled something different, could have changed outcomes, or maybe I lost a job, or, something went south in communication. And I remember having an architect on, Mark Candelaria. He's one of my first episodes. And he said, Brad, like, the thing is, we focus on our failures so much, and most people don't at all. Like, if I look at you, Jason, like I look at the heartful conversations we've had, the communication, certain examples you've given. And I'm sure on your side, it eats at you regret of things that choices you made throughout your life, of which I've never thought of once for you. I just think of the impact you've had on me. And I think so many times we dwell on these things that really are outside of our control and really just don't have really any meaning or bearing on things. And others aren't focusing on that. Like other people aren't looking at AFT, looking at my failures. They're looking at, this amazing house I posted, or successes,
Absolutely. It's interesting that you say that because we're what we would call meaning making machines. We create stories out of everything, right? And so we get so wrapped up in things that
Yeah.
aren't true or haven't happened, and we're playing the whole scene out. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah,
my
totally.
wife will catch me sometimes having conversations with myself. She's like, "Who are you talking to?" I'm having a conversation with someone in my head, but it's not. It's actually coming out, And one of the things that I actually want to touch on because I know we're coming up on time, but
Yeah.
gratitude is one of those key things that I think that if we can introduce that, more, especially with those that we're dealing with, if we can have gratitude for them and real true gratitude and finding gratitude for all things in our life, that sets this stage for God to really just show up. You just see Him just pour out when we are grateful for the things that we've been given, good and bad. So that's just another element to the many things that go into overcoming any hard thing in your life. But
Well, I want to give you some time to speak. I know that we'll have, Brandon on here. We have, Drew and Josh will be coming on. Speak about the Abundant Life event, even about the fan project where people can learn more and become familiar with, the movement that's taking place.
yeah, so we the Abundant Life Live is an event May 28th through the 30th, and you talked about finances. A lot of times people struggle in finances, and that's something that we learn in school, how to really manage a budget, or all of these life skills we don't learn in school, and so we're just
Hmm.
kind of thrown out in the woods, and we have to kind of figure things out for ourselves. And so and it's unfortunately it's the number one cause of divorce is financial strain on a family, and especially as a business owner, if you don't have some business acumen or aren't learning some skills, that can be really challenging. And so, Abundant Life Live is really how to have abundance in all areas of your life. We kind of lean in on the financial side because we know that if we can make just a little pivot there, that we can actually help a lot of families. We're creating products and services to make referring and sharing products that actually have served their families and helping that get out to the masses through a very simple referral program. That's kind of what I've been doing is affiliate marketing, they call it. We're leaning more towards the referral marketing side of things. And just, we want to go head to head with, Facebook and Google. It's like, why are we spending all these money on ads when a referral from someone else is way better? Well, let's reward those people that are giving us the referral. And so, Abundant Life Live is really about helping people find skill sets where they can up level their income, help them find ways to up level their parenting. So it's just the different areas of your life. We'll have teachers around those specific areas. We did the Family Survival Summit back in late 2020, early 2021 is when we launched that. And we had all of these speakers that came out. And so this one would be live in person, taking that same model that we did with the summit and just bringing real world education and tools that families can use to up-level their lives. So that's where we're going to kick everything off. We're going to launch the Fam Central app at that time. We're going to bring a lot of stuff for the summer, because we want to create alternatives, right? Because in order to overcome an addiction, you have to have two things. You have to have human connection and something to replace the addiction with, right? And so that's where our app Fam Central comes into play. It's like it's the safe place to social where we're giving deals, discounts, experiences, all the stuff to help families find alternatives to the screen. But you got to go where they're at.
You have to go where they're at. And again, as you mentioned, you have to have like a great alternative, great substitute, something that, is going to bring their passion. I think, a lot of us, a lot of people with addictions are passionate people. They're driven people, but, to the point where it could, lead the wrong direction. And that's where you have to get them back on track.
Yeah.
For those listening, of course, I do want you to share a little bit how they can find you and sign up. And, we'll have things in our show notes here. What do you do for fun?
Snowboard. Just went actually on Saturday with my son and his buddy. That's one thing that, when you're on the lift together and you're going up the mountain, you have that time to be able to connect in a way that, they call it the sandbox therapy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but where a kid's on the playground and they're playing in the sand, and you can have some deeper conversations about some hard traumatic things with a kid there, more so than you would, if they're sitting in a chair, and because I can't talk to my son. He doesn't want to tell me stuff that's going on if I just sit him down, because now it feels like interrogation, whereas,
interview.
yeah, exactly. Whereas, now we're going up the mountain, it's like all of a sudden he feels open because we're connecting. I think the more time we spend with our kids, which is ultimately what they want more than anything else, is time with us, is when you start to see them open up about what's going on in their life and how we can really influence them in a positive way. So snowboarding, definitely one of my favorite pastimes. And I love working. I love doing what I'm doing. I love seeing transformation. I love when someone's light bulb goes off, they have an aha moment, and you see them just shift. And I just see when lives change. I'm a junkie when it comes to that type of stuff. So I guess it's a good thing to be addicted to.
It is good, especially when it comes to that. But, well, Jason, I can't thank you enough for the vulnerability, for the conversation, for, everything you spoke to us about. So for those listening, how can they find you, and learn more?
Well, you can go hit me up on Facebook, any of the socials. Our website is going to be Abundant Life Live. We're putting it together right now. I know this show won't air for another 30 days, so it'll be live by that time. And then Abundant Man Project is our event that we're doing April 17th through the 19th. So if you want to get involved, you can go to the FAM Project right now, and you can sign up to be part of what we're doing. Arizona is our primary focus right now. We're actually launching mostly in Arizona, and we're curating those experiences and working with a lot of the local business owners and truly creating community around this whole movement. Because a lot of people want to get involved. As you can imagine, a lot of moms are the ones that are seeing their kids actually, because they're with them all the time, mostly. And they're the ones that want to see something like this come to fruition, and they're really excited about what we're building. And I've heard nothing but good feedback from the moms of the world. So we're excited to help them get their men right. So,
well, appreciate
and ourselves right.
It's much needed, Jason. So thank you for making time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brad. Appreciate you.